Was there ever a Jesus? Well, that depends on exactly what you mean. The Jesus of the Bible, or just some guy living in Palestine around whom the early Christian cult eventually arose? Define your terms. But here comes a Christian con man to tell you that he's gotta be right because, fee-fees. Because honestly, what else can he do? So, this time, we're off to Capturing Christianity with Cameron Bertuzzi and Gary Habermas as he tries to convince us that Jesus mythicism isn't a thing. Yet he only addresses a straw man because that's all they can really do. They can't actually handle the fact that there simply isn't any actual evidence for Jesus and his super friends in the Bible. The second you get rid of blind faith, the whole thing simply falls apart. And the religious can't handle that, so they just lie. They misrepresent the opposition. What else are they supposed to do? So let's just get to it.
So what is, in your mind, the fastest way to disarm a mythicist?
I've got a book called Historical Jesus where I list 12.5 texts, many of them outside the New Testament, in the ancient world for the existence of Jesus.
Except we've already done away with all of those. There are no objectively demonstrable, direct eyewitness accounts of Jesus, period. There just aren't. So the people claiming that there are these texts, either they're lying to you, or they're only telling you half the truth because they know that these things aren't real. And for people like Gary here, he has no excuse by continually making these claims. These are people who have said the same thing for years and years and years on end, and have been corrected for years and years and years on end, yet they don't care, because they are not interested in truth, only emotions and money. You can't forget about the money. They've got books to push and congregations to fleece, and those things don't fleece themselves. These claims simply do not stand up to any kind of rational evaluation. So let's watch him get it all completely wrong.
But one probably better example I would use, some say, yeah, but you're a Christian. Okay, Bart Ehrman, an atheist New Testament scholar. Bart Ehrman gives 15 independent sources for the crucifixion of Jesus within 100 years.
But Bart Ehrman isn't saying that Jesus rose from the dead. And no matter what Bart Ehrman says, none of that proves that Jesus was crucified. These are claims, not independent and objectively verified truth. There is a difference no matter what you want to believe. Now, I'm not saying that Jesus absolutely never existed. I'm saying that the evidence that we have, that doesn't provide sufficient proof that he did exist. Because it doesn't. But it also doesn't matter, because the version of Jesus that Christians demand existed, that version has absolutely no evidence of any kind, period. And that's the problem that the religious run into. Even if there was some guy named Jehoshua ben Joseph running around Palestine 2,000 years ago, that provides absolutely zero corroboration for the things that Christians believe. It's why Christians like Habermas just gish-gallop their way from, there's evidence that some kind of a Jesus existed, to, that proves our Jesus was real. And it doesn't work that way.
Now, 100 years is actually kind of strict, but it's a nice, narrow parameter for saying Jesus lived. 100, and here's an atheist, 100 years time, 15 different sources evidencing Jesus' death.
Except none of those sources were written by demonstrable eyewitnesses. We can point to far more examples of people writing about Harry Potter in just 20 years. that doesn't prove anything about the actual existence of a real Harry Potter, does it? And that's really where they run into problems, because they pay attention to the things they want to pay attention to, and they simply ignore all the rest. Why? Because they have a goal in mind. They have somewhere they need to go for emotional reasons. And that doesn't mean that it's true. I mean, look at Roswell. We have far more than 15 sources in 100 years of Roswell, right? I ran over to Amazon, and there are about 1,200 books on Roswell in print right now. Does that mean that there was actually an alien spaceship that crashed there? No, of course not. It's the quality of the claims, not the numbers, that matter. And the quality, when it comes to Jesus, it's very, very low, isn't it?
If he died, he had to have lived. So Bart Ehrman calls that one of the two best evidences we have for that Jesus lived in history. The other one is that Paul is the best New Testament reference we have.
Which isn't saying a lot, because we don't even know if there was a historical Paul. Certainly there was someone who wrote those books. There were multiple people, in fact, we now know, who wrote the things that were once attributed to Paul, but that doesn't mean that the things that were written, that those actually happened. Because Paul, or the author of those Pauline books, he wasn't an eyewitness either. Here's a guy that had a drug trip on the way to Damascus, and beyond that, we have no other demonstrable historical record of the guy. He doesn't mention the miracles of Jesus. He barely mentions the resurrection. And regardless, everything that he's saying is, at best, hearsay. So how is he any better than the people writing about Roswell? He's not. But the Christians have an agenda and an emotionally comforting conclusion that they have to reach, so they just don't care.
Critics talk about half of Paul's epistles, 7 out of 13, being accredited, and you can use them in arguing because they're great sources. Well, the best thing Paul gives us is that he was an eyewitness to the eyewitnesses.
Well, that's what he claims. That doesn't mean that it's true. And that's the problem that we have. The Christians are just assuming that the things in the Bible are true without being able to prove that the things in the Bible are true. And that's why historians look for multiple, demonstrable, independent eyewitness accounts, and the Bible provides absolutely none of those. All of the books are anonymous, either because they give no indication who wrote them, or because they're just claimed to have been written by someone, but you can't verify it, and church tradition has just filled in all of those holes. Yep, church tradition doesn't actually mean a thing. I don't care about your traditions. I care about your facts, and you absolutely have none of those. It's why Christianity is a house of cards built on emotions and assumptions, and the second that those things get rejected, because none of those are demonstrable, their entire belief system falls apart. I'm not interested in what you believe. I'm interested in what you can prove. Get to work.
Paul in Galatians 1 and again in Galatians 2, he went to Jerusalem and got to know Peter, James, the brother of Jesus. Then in Galatians 2, John, they're all together. And the topic they're discussing, as Paul tells us, is the nature of the gospel, to make sure they're all on the same page. And Paul concludes, yes, they're all on the same page.
Which doesn't actually mean anything. No one else wrote about those supposed meetings. No one else claims to have been an eyewitness. Just because the author of the Pauline books, whoever the hell that was, says these meetings took place, that doesn't mean that these meetings took place. Because what's the fastest way to claim validity for your writings? Claim that someone famous approves of them. Because you have to remember that the average life expectancy at the time was about 50, more or less, and Galatians was written somewhere between 50 and 60 CE. and that makes it somewhat questionable if the writer of Paul would have been able to meet up with a bunch of people the age that Jesus supposedly was for a powwow that late in time. But again, we don't know if any of this was even real. Maybe it was someone who took stories circulating around Jerusalem and just used them in their own books. There's no way to tell, and that's the problem.
But here, that's two great sets of data for the existence of Jesus. 15 independent sources for the crucifixion of Jesus, and Paul knowing himself, of course, Peter, James, and John, the big four. He knows all of them, and he can ask them whatever questions he wants to about what Jesus looked like when he was walking and talking in Galilee.
But that still makes a lot of assumptions that are not independently verifiable, which, as I keep saying, that's the problem. The religious have a vested interest in maintaining their beliefs for emotional reasons. There is no more reason to trust what the Bible says than to trust what the Quran or the Vedas or the Book of Mormon say. All of the people who believe these things, they do it for the same reasons that Christians believe the Bible, because it makes them feel good. But that's not a sufficient reason to take these claims seriously. There are no double standards. If there is one standard we're going to apply to one book, then we're going to apply it to all books, and the religious refuse to do that. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, and they haven't even achieved the level of evidence necessary to establish perfectly normal claims, never mind the extraordinary crap that they want to pretend is valid. So, no, you're just wrong. Sorry.
So it would be like asking George Washington, or asking Thomas Jefferson, what was George like? Asking Adams and John Quincy Adams and Monroe and so on, what do you know about George? And then it'd be really cool if you could talk to Martha. And that's neat because we have the women's testimony for going to the tomb and so on. So you make a multifaceted case for George Washington being the first president of the United States. We can do the same thing with Jesus actually having existed.
Except you can't. Because all of the people you mention, they can be verified as having existed independently, of having seen George Washington independently, etc. We have multiple, demonstrably independent eyewitnesses to all of it. We have people that we can prove were real, who weren't writing anonymously, who we have records of their births and their deaths. We have portraits of these people painted while they were sitting right there. We have nothing of that sort with Jesus or of any of the supposed apostles. Now, that's not to say that's the only criteria that we can use, only that it's a whole lot more powerful than, well, it says so in a book that I like. And this kind of crap comes up a lot if you notice. You will see apologists saying, well, you can't prove Socrates existed. Okay, that's fine. But my entire life, my entire belief systems are not based on the existence of Socrates. I don't give a damn if Socrates existed. If you want to say Socrates wasn't real, fine, I'll go with that. I don't care. But they can't do that with Jesus. They can't say, well, okay, Jesus didn't exist. Because without Jesus, Christianity doesn't exist. This is completely stupid.
And as Bart Ehrman says, he knows of nobody, no accredited specialist in the field of religion, no matter how liberal, or how atheist, or whatever, none of them who will have university, college, or seminary positions, none of them teach that Jesus never lived.
Yet there are. It doesn't really matter. This is just an appeal to authority. And you notice how he said, in the field of religion. Well, that's not history, that's theology. Secular historians, the ones who don't care about faith, only facts, they often take the position that there isn't enough evidence for the existence of a real historical Jesus. And keep in mind, he's running around with a straw man here. The rational position, the one that I take, is that there's insufficient evidence to establish that a real Jesus, any kind of real Jesus, ever lived. That isn't a position that no Jesus ever lived, only that we lack the evidence necessary to establish that Jesus actually did. And even if we could prove that some guy ran around Palestine 2,000 years ago, that wouldn't do Christians any good, because they don't believe in some guy, they believe in a miracle-doing man-god, and there's absolutely no evidence for that at all. It doesn't matter if you prove some guy existed. That gets them absolutely nowhere in proving that their religion is true. But yeah, let's just keep going.
The guys who teach it and claim to be scholars are people who don't have accredited degrees. He said with two exceptions, is Bart's count. The rest do not have accredited degrees, and none of them have university positions.
Which isn't really relevant. There are people who do hold that position. Trained, well-educated people, and Habermas just wants to discredit them because they aren't saying the words that he wants them to say. It's all a straw man. Yet, if you looked at people who were saying there was no real evidence for Jesus, especially the Jesus that Gary believes in, you'd find tons of them. Tons. Many tons. Why? Because Gary is lying to his audience. He's spinning a narrative that simply isn't true. He's taking the rational language that science favors and turning it against them. Well, if they're not saying Jesus absolutely did not exist, that must mean that they believe that he did. And no, that's not what's being said.
Why are they making such a big splash, do you think?
Probably because they infiltrate almost every website there is and have a bunch of, they have a loud presence. Whatever side you're on, recently, there was a choice for a Supreme Court justice in this country. How come the voices that made it on the news shows were the little chattering voices that ran next to the senators and got up in their ear and chirped at him and wouldn't let them sit down at the tables, and because that kind of thing makes the news.
And to some degree, he's right. Those are the ones that people pay attention to because controversy sells, even if there's no real controversy there. However, that's not what's going on here. Historical verification is more than someone's individual opinion. It's the same reason that conspiracy theorists get interviewed a lot. It's why there are so many Bigfoot and UFO shows on TV, because people want to watch crazy crap. That doesn't make that crazy crap true. When it comes to scholarship, we don't want to listen to the crazy crap, though. We want to look at the evidence, and for Christianity, that evidence just isn't there. It doesn't matter what you want to be true. It matters what you can provide objectively verifiable and demonstrable evidence for. And you people have none. And it's why you spend so much time trying to spin your narrative, so you can get where you people desperately want to go.
And people say, whoa. And when they say, oh no, and they pretend like they're scholars, no, but they don't have any training, they haven't been in the field, and all the other scholars, atheists even, like Bart Ehrman, say they're wrong. So to me, that's the real test. It's not just Christians saying they're wrong. It's non-Christian scholars saying they don't have a chance.
But they're not saying that you're right. There's a difference. Because even if there was a Jesus, and I'm not saying one way or the other, I'm simply not convinced, it's not the Jesus that you need. A real person that might have lived once, that doesn't get Christians anywhere close to Christianity being true. Yet they're only too happy to play make-believe because they just don't care. That's what this all comes down to. They don't care. So long as they reach the conclusion that they want to reach and they get their dose of happy chemicals in the brain, that's all they care about. That's it. That's their entire goal in a nutshell. Feeling good. Not being factually correct, not having any evidence for their beliefs because, who cares about that? They only want to be happy. And I'm sorry, but that's just not enough. And this is really the point that I keep on making, but the second that I do, Christians just head for the hills. Why? Because they've got nothing of value to say. I know my fair share of trained historians. The universities are turning them out in far greater numbers than there are jobs for them to take, and a lot of them acknowledge that there simply isn't credible evidence for the actual existence of any kind of Jesus. Definitely not for the magical man-god that Christians demand, but not really for the other one either. But in reality, it just doesn't matter. We could prove without a doubt that Jehoshua ben Joseph was real tomorrow, and it doesn't get Christians one step closer to proving their magical father figure in the sky is real. It doesn't help them, not one bit. The only thing they can do is believe they're right because they want to be right. But that doesn't really get them anywhere, does it? Faith doesn't matter. Your wishes and dreams don't matter. Only reality does, and when we look at reality, we see that there's really nothing out there to help them. So they have to lie about it. And that's what these people are doing. It's why they're not out there talking to actual historians. They're on a Christian talk show with a Christian host and a Christian audience saying things that Christians want to hear. Because they're not going to say anything critical or ask any hard questions to answer. And that's what the apologists want. No challenge and a gullible audience. Because the second they stray outside of their comforting safe space, they get splattered. That's just the way it goes. And that's why they're so terrified of us.